All right, good afternoon. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Professor Norman Bailey and Mr. Bernard Tubal. Dr. Bailey is a professor of economic statecraft at IWP. He currently resides in Israel, where he has taught at 3 different institutions of higher learning. Professor Bailey has a background in the armed forces, business, finance, consulting, and academia. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the City University of New York. He is a graduate of Oberlin College and Columbia University. Mr. Bernard Tubal is, for the last 30 years, international expert in customs administration and enforcement, border management, and international trade facilitation. He was involved in institutional and governmental development in many countries, including Africa, Asia, Central Asia, Western Balkans, specializing in policymaking and strategy crafting for combating illicit trafficking and trade-based money laundering-related frauds. He was an official of the French Customs Service. He also holds several graduate degrees in international trade, business administration, and political sciences. Dr. Bailey and Mr. Tubal, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. The book that we're talking about today, The Servants of the Devil, The Facilitators of the Criminal and Terrorist Networks, was published in February. The book is about the legitimate professional firms, such as law firms, accounting firms, public relations firms, financial firms such as banks and others, businesses, NGOs, and high-tech companies that facilitate the operations of the criminal and terrorist networks, fully understanding and knowing what they do. We will now turn the program over to Bernard, who is my co-editor in this book, and to present a summary of Chapter 1, the introduction, and Chapter 2 on professional facilitators. Bernard.
Thank you very much. Either legal or illegal, but after the Cold War, the world has changed with the emergence of multiple non-state actors that are as rich, powerful, and influential as states, and that can even oppose and fight the nation states. So it's now possible to be both communist and capitalist, to be good and bad, to be a businessman and a gangster, and all of that at the same time. So it's a form of hybridity of actors that has been created in a complexity of social, economic, and political interactions. Also, this undisputed victory of capitalism that has paved the way for a total freedom of enterprise, where the logic of market is the engine of the world. A total freedom of enterprise without limit for globalization to finally create its own perversion. So the financial crisis of the liberal system have led to the formalization of the use of the dirty money for crime and terrorism as a systemic and indispensable engine for the balance of world economy and its financing. This has intensified the opportunities for criminals to affect the life of everyone, and on a daily basis, and in the very terms of the social contract between state and citizens. This osmosis, meaning this constant interpenetration between the hybrid legal and illegal globalization, creates both legal and illegal wealth. But it's also the opportunity to transform this illegality into legality and vice versa. And this is what facilitators offer, in fact. These conditions that create an environment in which criminals and terrorists can emerge, thrive, continue to influence, and finally even govern the world, both politically and economically speaking. Today, the amount of dirty money infiltrating the legal world economy is so large that it cannot be removed. Otherwise, the world order would be seriously endangered or even would collapse. We see more and more states that today officially include even the share of the illicit economy in the calculation of their national wealth, in the GDP. We speak about 15 to 20% in Europe, or even in countries like in Balkans, we reach even 50% of the GDP is based on the illicit economy. And I think that this infiltration is too deep now just to be an anomaly that the liberal market system could absorb or even rectify by itself. So the criminalization of economy has brought about a profound change in transformation in the nature of the political and economical actors of influence and power. First, for instance, the entrepreneur is no longer the moral character of the 18th century traditional bourgeoisie. He is now a predator with a sense, a feeling of total freedom of enterprise. He is aggressive, violent against his competitors or anyone who could disrupt his plans. And even to the point of using illegal methods of corruption, bribery, intimidation, and the like, simply to survive or dominating the global markets. The borderline between businessmen and gangsters becomes definitely now very blurred. Second, the usual distinction between legal and illegal economy is no longer relevant. The impact of dirty money, criminal and terrorist activities can no longer be ignored in this new dominant economic model, which is built on complex interactions between legal and illegal businesses. You may know that according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the 40% of all foreign direct investment in the world is invested in shell, phantom, or offshore companies in tax havens. Third, the convergence of interest between terrorist groups and organized crime shows how terrorists today now use the methods and networks of criminals, and how, conversely, the criminals use corruption, intimidation, excessive violence, which is typical of terrorism, to create, maintain, and keep their territorial zones of non-governance far beyond the reach of state law enforcement. In fact, either in criminalization of terrorism or the radicalization of crime, both ultimately come together in a business and profit-seeking logic. Often, we see the initial militant ideological struggle of terrorists, for instance, give way to a motivation of an easy and quick enrichment for a criminal elite. In fact, the heart of war is still and always money. Therefore, the efficiency of the crime fighting and control policies can only be limited if they do not take into consideration this hybridity and variable geometry of crime and terrorism network. Criminal actors are still often categorized and labeled under single headings. They are either terrorist or criminal. It's like either Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, but in fact, it's exactly the same man. This has long been a mistake, and it is even worse because of the inadequacy and failure of the international cooperation, nevertheless necessary, between sovereign and national law enforcement agencies and justice jurisdictions. Also, another point is the acceleration of this change in the hybrid nature of crime and terror is the result of new technologies in cyberspace. The new routes of real-time data and information exchange through internet have opened up new avenues for trafficking of information and thus of goods, money, and people. This is, of course, linked to a strong culture and belief in science associated with social progress. So money is generated and then injected into the global economy in complete anonymity through opaque mechanisms and networks. Criminals and terrorists are like ghosts, omnipresent, and their cybercrimes affect masses of anonymous victims. They can strike everywhere on the planet, everyone at the same time. Anyone can be a victim, and at the same time, anyone can also be a cyber criminal. In addition to all of that, all criminal activities require to interact deeply with legal businesses for buying or selling goods and services in a business-like manner. Criminal organizations produce as well, distribute, sell, purchase, invest, make profits on legal and illegal products. They are very careful of covering their operational costs or reinvesting in business strategy of internationalization or specialization and so on. The difference is that they do not pay taxes to the state and they do their own justice. Crime should no longer be seen or treated as a manifestation or a symptom of a marginal behavior from marginal actors, meaning those who are said to be unable to understand and appreciate the benefits of our dominant model. And this is what led today to the very low level of seizure of laundered money, less than 1%, or the level of seizure of illicit goods, less than 10%. Finally, I would add to that a key factor is also that the fundamental democratic principles in the service of the human dignity are also key drivers of the criminal economy. Indeed, democratic suffrage allows criminals and terrorists to use their social pressure on the population. Don't forget that they provide jobs to people, protection, access to money, kind of justice to people. So they can offer blocks of voters to corrupt politicians in exchange for laws favorable to their illicit activities. Or they can even create their own political parties and influence the legislative power, like in some countries, like in Lebanon, for instance. In conclusion, and maybe most importantly, the relationship between state and crime in liberal democracies takes the form very often of a capitulation or resignation. And there is a deep tendency of acceptance and legitimization of violence and injustice inherent to crime and terror by states and population alike, even if deeply penetrating in their daily life. So this is what I wanted to say as introduction for the global book. And if you allow, I would go to the next chapter, which is related to the professional facilitators. Professional facilitators, but maybe more importantly about the framework of the ecosystem of facilitation that is offered to criminals and terrorists to accelerate and intensify their nefarious activities. Facilitators are not just these immoral, unscrupulous, corrupt, professional white-collar characters who sell their souls to the devil and are often stigmatized or demonized in books and even in Hollywood movies now. Of course, these are legitimate, non-violent facilitators who, without bloodshed and legally speaking, help criminals through their technical expertise of lawyers, accountants, communicators, computer specialists, NGOs, and so on. But there are also several other facilitating factors that shape the environment in which this technical and operational facilitation can take place. So there are, of course, these facilitators who belong to the criminal organization, to the mafia family, to the terrorist groups. They have an internal function within the organization to organize money laundering, set up offshore companies, carry out online cyber attacks, and so on. They have high degrees usually, and their studies are paid for by crime. Another facilitating factor comes from states that use criminals and terrorists as proxies with hidden interests. They facilitate their existence as much as they can decide to fight them in a policy for combating crime and terror. There are, of course, deviant states, Russia, Iran, whatever, but also our own democracies, which play this double game for reasons of domestic policies or international and geostrategic foreign policies. There are also the multinational companies that contribute to this ecosystem, which in total freedom of enterprise exploit human beings, affect the environment through corruption, intimidation, opaque tax arrangements, and so on. And there are also the citizens. They are key actors of the liberal and democratic consumer society. They are usually ignorant or negligent consumers, but there are also those who consent to a level of acceptance and legitimization of criminal activities. They determine the types and volumes of criminal products on the legal and illegal markets. There is also the responsibility of the media and media moguls, of course, that construct the image, the collective consciousness, the truth of the public about who is criminal and who is not, who should be demonized or who should be tolerated. They shape the belief system of each of us as citizens, public society, or consumers of information. Eventually, there is the key factor of internet, with its technical tools, actors, users, and regulators who allow through cyberspace to organize, prepare, execute their mass criminal and terrorist actions in total anonymity, in time and space ubiquity, to finally remain far beyond the reach of law enforcement and justice. So it's within this framework that our professional facilitators can act and sell their, and most of the time, legally speaking, their technical expertise to the devil as to any other normal client. And for many reasons, might be money, it might be influence, competition, fear and intimidation as well. Also because it's simply possible. So they navigate and surf on the vulnerabilities and technical or legal weaknesses of the legal and financial system. So in conclusion about this chapter, who should be blamed for facilitating crime when everyone is concerned and involved more or less directly and consciously, and especially when state abandons its governance role to the benefit of criminal and terrorist networks? Thank you, and over to you, Norman.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Before I go on to the next chapter, which is about financial facilitators of the criminal and terrorist networks, I just want to mention one example of the professional facilitators. In 2016, an American NGO sent people around to 13 of the most prestigious law firms in New York and asked for their assistance in setting up a network of front companies which were obviously intended, although they didn't say so openly, obviously intended to launder money. And of those 13 very prestigious law firms in New York, only one refused to take the business. Anyway, that we will. I'm going to now discuss chapter 3 of the book, which is financial facilitators, particularly banks. The chapter was written by two Israeli investigators, Yitzhak Zahavi and Yaron Hazan. Criminal and terrorist networks use banks and other financial institutions primarily for two purposes. The laundering of illicit funds, which they have received and that they put then into the legal economy, and for the movement of funds among and between the various criminal groups and terrorist organizations to finance their activities. The traditional methods of money laundering are the use of shell companies in various countries around the world, and banks also in various countries around the world who interact and facilitate the transfer of these funds for the criminal and terrorist networks. However, the new methods are becoming more and more important. Such things as crowdfunding, video games, fantasy sports, luxury cars, fine art and antiquities, capital market trading, trade-based money laundering, and finally, and probably most important of any of these, cryptocurrencies. To quote the authors of this chapter, quote, "This is the best way to transfer value and stay anonymous," unquote, namely the use of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and many others. The authors finish the chapter with a case study from 2012 of the HSBC Bank, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the multi-year facilitation by the bank of criminal money laundering and financial transfers, which led to a $1.9 billion fine and 5 years of monitoring by the Department of Treasury in the United States. I'll now turn it back over to Bernard, who will summarize chapter 4, the business facilitators.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a little bit instability on the line, so sorry. So I'm back now. So regarding the business facilitators, the key point is that today there is a deep nexus between crime, politics, and business through endemic corruption, money laundering, and violence. But at the same time, governments remain unresponsive very often to societal, political, economic, and sanitary crises now. So this creates a void space necessary for crime to penetrate all layers of economic and political governance. This led to a criminal business model where criminals manage their activities according to very usual principles of like cost and benefit analysis or maximization of profits in order to finance operational activities, of course, but also to develop and maintain a business position in legal and illegal markets, and also position in the terrorist ideological movement like Al-Qaeda is doing today. In fact, criminal organizations use exactly the same theoretical models, strategies, and techniques of business organization, management, production, marketing as any legal or conventional businesses. They are microeconomic functional units of the hybrid world economy in the both licit and illicit globalization. They need interaction with legal companies in order to navigate easily between legal and illegal. They use offshore shell companies in tax havens, recycle and launder dirty money, invest, transfer funds across borders, extend their influence over territories or economic sectors. Today, the cash flow needed to feed in the international financial bubble comes from multinational criminal organizations. The 'Ndrangheta Italian mafia, the profits are higher than profits of Microsoft of McDonald's and Deutsche Bank together. The returns on investment in criminal industries are much, much higher than in kind of index like CAC 40 or Dow Jones or whatever. But in parallel, and as a consequence of capitalism, the ignorance or acceptance of the criminal dimension of business is the way for the legitimate companies to remain present in a business or on a market. In this new economic business model, it's necessary to compete with legitimate and illegitimate competitors that unfairly steal subsidies or produce and market counterfeit products or whatever. But anyway, those who become dominant on the markets. This is a deep change in the business world. You know, 30 years ago, criminals were looking for complacent banks to launder money. Today, the banks are looking for this dirty cash flow to make profit and remain in the banking business. Any individual business, SME, multinational, any businessman producing, distributing, can deeply be involved, consciously or not, in a hybrid web of both legal and illegal activities that ultimately, anyway, serve the interest of crime and terrorism. Every legal business can be instrumentalized, targeted, or victimized by a strategy of alliance or competition between criminal and legal businesses. In fact, and it's interesting, interaction with legal businesses follow very clear and strategic objectives. They target the cash flow intensive businesses for money laundering, the bars or restaurants and nightclubs or whatever. They target cheap labor intensive businesses to reduce costs by exploiting immigrants, women, children. Businesses that benefit from state subsidies like in transport sector, construction, agro-business, and businesses involved in newly or not yet regulated markets. So as a conclusion, it's a matter of fact that today, in this hybrid economic model, criminal organizations have the power to influence, affect, and even control all types and all sizes of businesses, meaning the whole world economy. Thank you again, and over to you, Norman.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And let me just point out that one of the most spectacular examples of business facilitation of a terrorist network was when the oil trading companies purchased and distributed the oil produced by Islamic State or ISIS in northern Iraq and western and eastern Syria. Because they were very happy to do this because they got the oil at a discount, which increased their profit margins. And the fact that it was one of the most horrible terrorist organizations in the history of the world didn't bother them in the slightest. Okay, a summary of chapter 4, which is chapter 5, I'm sorry, which is nonprofit facilitators. This chapter was written by Rachel Ehrenfeld, who runs 2 think tanks in New York. They're national and international advocacy organizations, excuse me, have taken an increasing role in international relations. Think tanks that generally claim to be promoting environmentalism or human rights, or that they're charitable organizations, and actually have as their purpose advocacy of national and international policies which are favorable to the interests of the criminal and terrorist networks. Some examples of these given by Dr. Ehrenfeld. The International Islamic Relief Organization, which is affiliated with Al-Qaeda. The Third World Relief Agency, which funded illicit weapons traffic in the Balkans and the Middle East, which is affiliated with the Taliban. The Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, which is funding Hamas. And at the end, Rachel gives as a case study the Open Society Foundations of the billionaire George Soros, which has funded over several years dozens of criminal and terrorist-linked groups. Okay, over to you, Bernard, for a summary of Chapter 6, High-Tech Facilitators.
Okay, thank you very much, Norman. So this last chapter is about the facilitation from technologies and internet in the cyberspace. Cyberspace is the point of interaction between a physical world and a virtual world, imaginary world, without boundaries of time and or space. It's a world where technology is both the promise of a bright future and the domain of most frightening threats for humanity. A humanity with a deep belief in rational science in a hyper-connected world. but unlimited access to everything and everyone in real time has become the immense opportunity for crime to intensify the anonymity and virality of its actions. It's the ultimate battlefield where criminals act at the speed of light, while law enforcement and justice can only respond at the pace of law and administrative bureaucracy, or even limited by divergent national jurisdiction. It's a dimension where criminals impact the physical world and go back into hiding, disappearing into an invisible world. So the very nature of crime and criminals has changed. The line is blurred between the traditional immoral criminals with key aptitudes to violence and the cyber criminal acting with a deep sense of total freedom, almost juvenile, since in cyberspace nothing can be forbidden, feeling that nobody can catch him, feeling that nobody can know who and where he is. There is a very good example of the Silk Road application that we explain in the book with Russell Bricht founder, perfect geek in fact. Also, the cyberspace has shifted the focus from the value of things to the value of information and data. The routes and movements of data trade are the key targets today of cybercrime and cyberterrorism, like routes of trade in goods were targets of crime and piracy. Therefore, the facilitation phenomenon takes new forms to enable digital, intrusive but non-violent frauds without bloodshed, without any physical contact between criminals and mass victims. It makes now possible to steal people's identity, to embezzle a huge amounts of money very discreetly, to disseminate fake news anonymously, to develop mass propaganda in real time for radicalization, recruitment, or promotion of hatred and terrorism. Also, social networks play a major role in personal data frauds. The likes of Facebook becomes our own enemies. Cookies are the most effective spies in our lives. The main changes in the very concept of crime are becoming more and more visible. Firstly, the asymmetry between the criminal and his mass victim, or between the means used and the results obtained, is characteristic of cybercrime. Secondly, cyberspace allows states to affect foreign economies, weaken infrastructures, interfere in the democratic process of elections, and all of that without even being an act of war. Thirdly, there is nothing personal in the game of cybercrime. Anyone can be a victim of cybercrime, but anyone can also be a cybercriminal without leaving any evidence behind him. Anyone can access the dark web, consult YouTube for a recipe on making a bomb or whatever, buy bitcoins online in total anonymity. As in conclusion, crime existed before internet for sure, but cyberspace and those who know how to use it and how to navigate in it have created an environment that is even more conducive for crime and terror, while the law and the state are absent. It makes criminals to have now definitely an easier, a more profitable, and a more discreet life. Thank you, Norman. Up to you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Summarizing now chapter 7 of the book, the conclusions and recommendations. In beginning my discussion of this chapter, or my summarization of this chapter, I want to mention, besides all of the other facilitators that were covered by the various chapters in the book, that there are now state actors such as Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Turkey, which extensively use these criminal and terrorist networks for their own purposes. Some of the most obvious are, of course, the use by Iran of Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But there are many other examples of the use of these criminal and terrorist networks by states. and the emergence of what one might call criminal states, such as Lebanon, which is a sovereign state. It also happens to be controlled by a criminal terrorist organization. Guinea-Bissau in Africa, which is entirely controlled by criminal networks having to do with the traffic in illegal drugs from Latin America to Europe, and Venezuela, which facilitates all kinds of activities of this nature and has become a criminal state. In terms of conclusions, I would say that there are three principal conclusions. And here I'm going to quote specifically from the book. A very significant portion of the world's economic and financial activity is now controlled by criminal syndicates, often allied with terrorist organizations, unquote. Secondly, quote, all efforts to deal with, much less to defeat, this burgeoning criminal terrorist network have been a manifest failure, unquote. The only example we have in the entire world of an agency which has been quite successful in its task is the U.S. Treasury Department. Other than that, all the efforts of the law enforcement agencies of the Western countries and other countries around the world have been manifest failures in this respect. The role played by the criminals and terrorists reveals the need for a new paradigm of economy and governance. And our recommendations have to do with this new paradigm. And we recommend attacking directly the facilitators of the criminal networks because and terrorist networks, because they crave legitimacy. They are legitimate businesses. They are legitimate banks. They are legitimate professional firms, NGOs, and high-tech companies. So naming and shaming is a very important part of what should be done by the law enforcement agencies. Specific legislation directed towards the facilitators should be passed in the countries involved, with the establishment of specialized units in law enforcement agencies, national and international, throughout the world. Okay, Hannah, I think at this point, let's open it up for questions and answers and discussion.
Yeah, so now we're going to take questions. So if you have any questions for Mr. Tubal and Professor Bailey, please feel welcome to comment in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So the first question we have here is a two-part question. So I'll ask you the first part first and then follow up with the second part. How will blockchain and cryptocurrency affect the infusion of dirty money into the global system?
Well, as I mentioned, cryptocurrencies, which is a blockchain application, is probably the single most important contemporary financial help for the criminal and terrorist networks. It is totally anonymous, and it's going to make law enforcement with reference to money laundering and the financing of criminal and terrorist activities more difficult than ever. It's certainly a very important element that needs to be addressed directly.
The second part, will it make forensic tracking and source receiver identification easier or more difficult, if not impossible?
It's going to be much more difficult. Whether it's impossible, it remains to be seen. I mean, hopefully it's not impossible, but my own personal view, and there are lots of people who are better qualified than I am to address this particular issue. In my own personal view, the cryptocurrencies will have to be simply shut down, and it will eventually become clear and obvious that that's what has to be done.
The second question we have, why doesn't the media / politicians, etc., emphasize these factors?
Well, I would say that's a very good question, incidentally. I would say there are two reasons. And sometimes they come together. One was ignorance. Obviously, the criminal and terrorist networks and their facilitators don't advertise what they're doing. I mean, they try to keep it as secret as they can, and therefore, ignorance is one possible answer to that question. The other possible answer to that question is that they're complicit. That some of the politicians, obviously, in many countries throughout the world, are corrupt. That they're being paid off by particularly the criminal syndicates to support behind the scenes their activities and not to directly attack them, and so on. And as far as the media are concerned, I can only say that a great deal of the media at this point is made up of propaganda agencies for various point of view, and the idea of independent journalism has, to a very large extent, disappeared, unfortunately. But there have been substantial investigative work done on various aspects of money laundering and business facilitation, and there have been some books published about these various things. So there has been some media attention paid to it.
The next question I have is, how is this affecting the world stock markets?
Oh, how is this affecting the world stock market? Well, I mean, obviously, since a great deal of the activity, the economic activity in the world is now run by criminal organizations, they clearly are manipulating, in many cases, the stock market. I mentioned that also in talking about the more contemporary measures of money laundering and terrorist financing and so on, is manipulation of the stock and bond markets. And there's no question about it that, for example, I would say, and I don't have the time to go into it in any detail, but the fact that the stock markets have been, generally speaking, doing very well during this horrible coronavirus period, when the economies have not been doing well at all, it might very well be as a result of this kind of manipulation by the criminal networks. High frequency financing is, in terms of the contemporary use of these tools, extremely important. Excuse me.
The next question I have for you is, how do we drive a sense of urgency for decision makers to address facilitators and criminal terror networks pose? The interim national security strategic guidance is rife with other priorities, including domestic policy, the pandemic, the economy, great power competition.
Again, a very excellent question. And it is up to the people who are supposed to be and are charged with fighting the criminal syndicates and terrorist organizations to make it clear to their bosses, their political bosses, that it isn't going to work. What they're doing isn't going to work unless the facilitators are attacked directly, named and shamed and brought to justice and fined with huge fines and so on and so forth, and in some cases simply shut down. The law enforcement people have got to make this clear to their bosses. Now, it may be that their bosses are corrupt. This is all, it's quite possible, and is certainly true in many countries in the world. But in which case, there's nothing to be done. But I hesitate to think that in the major countries of the Western world, particularly in Europe and North America, that this is true throughout the political structure.
Next question I have is, we know that Iran is supporting Houthis in Yemen. Why did we think it was a good idea to remove Houthis from the terrorist list?
I'm sorry, to remove what?
To remove the Houthis from the terrorist list.
It was a very bad idea. I mean, if I wanted to take up the whole rest of our time, just listing all of the bad things that, in my opinion, have been done by all of the American administrations since George W. Bush, I could occupy 2 or 3 hours from now on. But this is just one. This is in a series of very bad moves. A lot of. It seems to me that the Biden administration has decided it's simply going to reverse whatever it can of whatever the Trump administration did, without actually looking into whether it was a good idea or not, but simply saying, if Trump did it, then we're opposed to it, and we're going to reverse it. It certainly, we saw the effects of this in the border situation with Mexico. I mean, instead of examining the situation and deciding what aspects of what the Trump administration did should be kept and what should be changed, and doing it gradually over a period of time, simply at a stroke in the first day of the Biden administration, they reversed the entire immigration structure that had been erected by Trump. And now we see the effect of it. And I could go on to other examples like the Keystone Pipeline decision and so on. And certainly the removal of the Houthis from the terrorist list was a very stupid thing to do.
Next question I have for you is, reportedly, the Islamic Republic of Iran has many financial assets in the US and Europe. They utilize these assets for illicit actions, of course. They have bank accounts at businesses, etc., and can actively use them. These are not assumptions, but facts. Why don't we close their assets?
Well, that's another very good question. Why don't we? And again, I have to say it's either because the situation is not understood by the people who do it, or those people they don't want to, because either they're corrupt or because they believe that what is being advocated by the Iranian regime is good, and any one of those three reasons is a very bad reason, and certainly those activities should be shut down, and again, our conclusion in our recommendation in the last chapter of the book is precisely that. You have to go after the facilitators and shut them down. Otherwise, forget it. I mean, directly attacking the criminal and terrorist networks is not going to work, and we've already seen that. And the only thing that has been successful are the activities of the Treasury Department, which of course is attacking the financial facilitators of these organizations.
The next question I have for you is, in many countries, facilitators and criminal organizations are so entwined with legitimate governance where we risk killing the patient by removing the parasite. Is the goal to minimize the facilitator/criminal network impact or to remove the parasite?
Actually, the goal, if governments pay attention to what we're saying in this book, the goal is to make it much more difficult for the criminal and terrorist networks to function. I mean, that's what the facilitators do. They facilitate. They make it easier for the criminals and terrorists to function, to do what they're doing. And the purpose of attacking the facilitators is to make it that much more difficult for the criminals and terrorists to operate. So, is it likely that even if our recommendations were adopted whole cloth by everybody, that we would eliminate all criminal and terrorist activity? Of course not. I mean, criminal and terrorist activity has been going on for centuries. But the point is now it is ingrained in the structure of the whole economic system of the Western world, and this is new. This is a new development.
One attendee asks, please elaborate on additional actions that can be taken in addition to public shaming.
Well, you can, of course, bring them to justice, accuse them and indict them and try them, and which incidentally will name and shame also, but and either find them or shut them down if you are successful in convicting them. And in many cases, it's not that difficult to identify. I mean, the oil trading companies that bought ISIS oil and distributed it are well known. The law firms that were contacted by this NGO in 2016 with money laundering in mind, and who agreed to engage in this activity, are well-known law firms. The banks, the biggest bank in Denmark, the biggest bank in Germany, HSBC, in the Citibank, have all been indicted and tried, and either made an agreement with the prosecutors or were convicted, and some of the fines were gigantic, as in the case of HSBC, which was mentioned as $1.9 billion. I mean, that's not a small fine.
All right, due to the limited time that we have this afternoon, we'll take two more questions. The next question I have is, what do we want to do with the Iranian oil ships heading to Venezuela? I believe that the max pressure worked very well against the Islamic Republic. Venezuela is sending gold to Iran reportedly. Why don't we take actions against these illicit activities?
Okay, why aren't we, by we, I presume the questioner means the Western world in general, or maybe they mean the United States particularly, I don't know. But the fact is that instead of taking action, well, the Trump administration took a lot of actions against both Venezuela and Iran, but they weren't sufficient to start to cause a regime change in either of those countries. But certainly that effort should be continued and strengthened. Instead of that, the Biden administration is trying to go back to the original agreement with Iran, which was a terrible agreement that was signed by actually nobody signed it, but anyway, it was made by the Obama administration. And so we're going in the opposite direction as far as that, as far as Iran is concerned. But you have other countries now which are engaging in these activities. Actually, the attitude of the Biden administration towards China, I think, is much better than it is otherwise. And Trump is actually quite friendly to Putin and Russia, and Biden is much less friendly, and that's good. And Turkey is getting away with all kinds of activities that are contrary to the interests of the Western world, and why it is still a acceptable member of NATO, for example, is a total mystery. Their membership in NATO should have been suspended, or they should have been expelled from NATO a long time ago. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, it's simple taking advantage of reality.
And the last question that I have this afternoon is, what do you believe are some actionable ways we can slow and mitigate the spread of this ethical and moral entropy infecting our commercial and governmental organizations?
Okay, what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to leave that one to for Bernard to respond to. Bernard, are you there?
Yes, I am here, Norman. I don't see the question anymore. Can you repeat it, Tana, please?
Yes, hang on, sorry, let me pull it back up. What do you believe are Here's the question. What do you believe are some actionable ways we can slow and mitigate the spread of this ethical and moral entropy infecting our commercial and government organizations?
Yes, this is what we said and what Norman has explained and highlighted about the naming and shaming. First of all, this is quite a strong decision and quite a strong action. Other type of action could be the raising awareness and responsibility. As we said, the consumer, the citizen is already one of the key actors and one of the key major elements of this mechanism and this entropy of infecting the consumption, the consumer, the citizen, the democracy, the governance, and so on. So this is definitely a factor that has to be action as well. The last one, or another one at least, is the possibility to give back governance to the state and to other actors and the criminals and the terrorists who are playing the role that should be taken by the governments in many places. I have some examples, and we have described some examples in the book about Western Africa, Sub-Saharan, Sahel region, all those countries where the state has disappeared from such big portion of the territories, where it is definitely left empty for the jihadists and terrorists to take place and to take the control of the situation there. So giving back governance, strong presence of the state in the different places for the governance, and giving back a lot of pressure for raising the awareness and the responsibility of the consumers and citizens. I believe more on the working on the quality of the consumers and citizens more than the other type of action at the very beginning. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I believe that is all the time that we have this afternoon. I would like to thank Dr. Bailey and Mr. Tubal for joining us this afternoon, and all of you who tuned in here on Zoom and Facebook. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that's iwp.edu. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.